Welcome to the Kawartha Small Business Podcast, where we believe the Kawarthas can be the most thriving region in Canada for small business. I'm Brian Rump from Profit Coach.
And I'm Matt Garrity of Manage Digital.
And before we get started, head over to kawarthasmallbusinesspodcast.ca and you can download Matt and Brian's marketing checklist for Kawartha small businesses. All right, Matt, today we are talking about the free market. We love freedom and we love free markets. And I thought we would do a whole episode about this topic because I often hear, small businesses will sort of, on one hand, complain about the government and talk about the free market. And we dig in what that means. Is the free market really free? And maybe walk through a few sort of examples of seeing it in action.
We haven't done an episode in a long time where I thought we are gonna get canceled. I'm almost certain this is gonna be one of them where we're gonna have to kind of cautiously. Are we gonna cautiously walk through some political nonsense and maybe expose how we lean politically, or what are we gonna do here?
Oh, I'm all for. I mean, we'll see how it goes because I think partly is the is tendency to make this political, but I don't think it really is political. So we'll do that dance a little bit.
That's true. We do love freedom. I don't know if there's anything more we love more as two individuals and professionals than freedom, which is extremely timely. So, yes, let's talk about the free market that people think exists. And I'll go on a very quick rant very quickly. I don't know if it'll be quick or how long my rant will be. And I'm going to offend people right away where there is and you're probably going to disagree, but there is a notion that we live in a free country and we are protected by the Constitution and all these other things that aren't actually real. I don't actually believe that we live in a free country. I think that we live in a better country, in a better situation than a lot of countries that are ruled by dictators and I want to say communists, but well, maybe communism isn't that bad. But I'm not truly a believer that we live in a completely free country. We have rules, we have regulations, we have laws, we have ways that we have to personally hold ourselves, whether that by ego or perception. Like, I don't think there's actually a true country in the entire world. Like, even the United States, the freest country in the world, they've got rules, they've got laws, they've got regulations, they've got that constitution that actually makes them have to fall in line with certain steps and everything. So, does what I just rambled on about make any sense, or was I the crazy uncle at Christmas?
You're a little bit the crazy uncle, but I think it makes definitely makes sense, and I think it does help frame our episode. So you'll hear a lot of people be like, "It's a free market, supply and demand should dictate all, and the government shouldn't be involved because we need to have, the free market." And people just get on about the free market. And we're dealing with a spectrum of like pure free, no rules market on one end, and we're dealing with completely planned market on the other end. So traditional communism is more centrally controlled, planned government or planned economy market, and the reality is we do have a mix of it. And I think where I get frustrated is political parties, people will definitely pick and choose when they think a free market should happen and when it should not. And a lot of small businesses will say, and they'll advocate for sort of the free market.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good discussion to have because, as you said, we do have rules, and any group of people, any society is going to create rules in that group, whether they're written down, whether they're just cultural rules. But you don't have complete freedom to like from consequences. So if you're like, oh, freedom, I can kill whoever I want, you know someone's gonna seek retribution against you. Like, so you don't really have that. So when it comes to the economy, people will talk about, the invisible hand of the free market, the not having those set regulations of centrally planned, the government saying, yes, you will make this and you will make this, and you will sort of buy and consume this. So you need the impact of humans, which is what messes everything up, is with their own preferences and ideas um, that sort of dictate what people should buy, what they sell, what they consume, how they collect and transfer wealth. And everybody's a little bit different. So we end up with kind of a mess that's never going to be perfect.
So, what exactly is a free market to you then?
Well, I think the idea of the free market is, we mostly have that, and I think we do need advocacy for, I think, breaking down some barriers from when that wasn't totally free. And when you dig into it, usually it's to protect the wealth of the elites. So, for example, if you look at the alcohol market and taxation, it's really complicated. So, like, you can't just start making moonshine in your garage and sell that to people. Whereas in a free market, you could. And there's one element there, which is something like safety, right? Like, so we need some regulations to make sure people are selling stuff that's not going to, immediately poison and kill anyone. So we have some regulations there. But beyond that, like, why can't you just make moonshine and sell it if it's safe? And, there's a good case for that to happen. But a long time ago, big companies put in big rules so that they could protect their right to make it in higher quantities and control the market. We see that with, craft brewers now. We're getting more of those, whereas for a long time we were dominated by a few just companies that use their power to get the government to sort of regulate and basically give them a monopoly. So I understand those, when you're a small business trying to compete with those historical and ingrained monopolies, it's definitely not fair and it should be opened up. But at the same time, you shouldn't be able to just poison people or sell stuff that's dangerous um, all on your own.
Yeah, I wanted to stop and ask you, do you think it's a good thing that people can't do and sell whatever they choose? But then you kind of beat me to it by talking about, well, you can't, it's not a good thing to poison and kill people.
Yeah. And I think, there's a safety thing there. You can blend that into like societal good things. Like a lot of prohibition was more about, a lot of sort of religious groups, people not wanting anyone to ever have alcohol. So, they lobbied the governments to put in rules to that effect. And we can see that with all sorts of like sort of sin related goods and products and why there's some control over them. But I think, in general, that stuff, regulations applies to all sorts of sort of products and goods and different things.
It's interesting that I'm just thinking about being in Ontario, Kawartha Lakes, Lindsay, and starting my businesses having very little barriers to entry, like almost none. In some cases, I think people don't even register their business and they just start kind of going about their business, which is not a big problem, to be honest with you. So,
Yeah, it's a huge sort of freedom thing, and why we're an attractive place to open a business is because of those barriers. There's countries in the world where for you to get a permit to operate a business could take you years or just a long time, or you might have to bribe an official to be able to do that. So, that stuff's tough. So I do agree, in a lot of principles about those barriers. And that's the other free part is so much has been made to protect people. And typically it's the elite, it's to protect their business interests. Becomes very unfair for poor people, racialized people, a lot of minorities historically don't have the same access to the free market. So, there's times where I'll hear people say, well, I want the free market. And then it's like, well, do you? Because a lot of those barriers benefit you. So, like, do you really want a free market where everyone has sort of free and equal opportunity to, start and create and run a business? Um, and they should want that, but oftentimes people don't recognize sort of the privilege that they have or the access that they have that not everyone has to different types of business.
Yeah, and like, how do we even create fair and equal opportunity for anyone to start a business?
Yeah, that's really hard. And I don't know that it's ever going to be completely fair and completely equal. But you can have, um, and they do it a little bit. So some of like the small business programs where they're starting out are sort of a way for people to access sometimes the knowledge they need to know, um, all the things they need to know about running their business. Sometimes it's just a cultural thing. They need to know that, yes, you are talented enough and you're as good as anyone else starting your business. Or that there isn't any weird regulations. Like you were like, well, there's not that many barriers to entry. I could just start my business. There could be people who don't know that. So it's a barrier from, knowledge or access to knowledge or mentors. So, there's that type of thing that helps free and open some of that.
And it's funny because a lot of that stuff is accessible. A lot of that information and resources are available, and it's available through the government.
Yeah, it is the government, and it's, they're maybe trying to make it easier to find. Maybe it's hard to find. Maybe you don't have the knowledge you need to navigate the government. Not everyone does. I know, we won't dive into it, but like the healthcare system, I am very unequipped to navigate that. And I know people who they seem to know everything, like about different types of tests people get, or like hospitals or regulations or things you can ask for. I'm like, I don't know about that, but I know that the business side, I can help get someone to navigate through to figure out how to grow a business or how to start a business or how to find out if you're even regulated. It's pretty easy to open up a Matty G digital type business. But if you were trying to open up a weed store, that's a whole other barrier and system that's not a free market.
Yeah, I was trying to think of some good examples like cannabis, telecommunications, etc. But I also wonder the biggest barrier to entry for probably most people, and even me when I was getting started, or still to this day, is often money. That's the biggest barrier.
Money. Yeah, and who's it protecting, right? You have money, right? Not everyone can get that. So again, those are things that, and they impact if we look at the macro, the free market, which is typically, supply and demand will take care of itself. But I always say though, in economics, it's almost like in physics. So in physics, they often talk about, a sphere in a vacuum will follow these rules. But in real life, you have things like gravity are impacting it. So in economics, we have humans that are impacting everything. So, pure supply and demand doesn't necessarily work because not everyone knows about like marketing or knows your thing exists. You don't always have the capabilities to manufacture it. So things are always delayed and, humans get in the mix of stuff. And some of that is just, who has the money already, to sort of protect it or to do the things that discourage other people from, jumping in and being their competitor.
Yeah, the first thing I thought about from like not having a free market, it seems like telecommunications. Like you've got the big companies in Ontario or maybe Canada.
Canada is just 3 telecommunication companies in a trench coat.
Yeah, exactly. But then I started to think, well, is it just also really difficult financially to set something like that up? Yeah, absolutely. not easy to. I don't even know how cell phones work. I'm sure it's satellites or microchips in our brain. It's not cheap to get those microchips in our brain. So
Oh yeah. Well, the big thing with telecommunications is, it's public, the frequencies and the spectrum. So there's like spectrum auctions. So, you can't just show up to the auction that day and buy enough space in the airwaves for that. And that's a historical barrier of why it's not a free market and why we don't have competition really in Canada. Like, we pay some of the highest cell phone rates in the world because we just don't have competition. And the ones we do have whine all the time and get government subsidies when they can. And part of it's warranted. We have massive geography and, things like cell phones. It's hard to set up networks over massive geography without an incentive to do so. Otherwise, they would all just be in Toronto and the cities where all the people live. And why would they put a tower in Northern Ontario beside a highway that very few people relatively use, right? So, so the government creates rules that sort of make them do that. Um, anyway, that's a whole other competition, but it's a good reminder that, in pure free market, we might not have what we sort of currently have, but we'd also probably have way cheaper rates in the cities because like everyone would be competing for, um, uh, the sale to the customer.
yeah, and it seems like there's a lot more regulation for services, and like almost I want to say almost every service. That's not true. A lot of services actually have a lot of regulation, and that's like I'm using actually more loosely licensing requirements, etc. Retail's different. Anyone can buy a bike and then try to sell the bike. Not everyone can be, and this is a bit of a stretch. Not everyone can just go ahead and start practicing law. That's a service. Not everyone can go and install. You can go and install HVAC systems. You need licenses and there's regulations for that. Even if you think about the CrossFit gym, buying into that license, you to use that brand, and like there's certain requirements for that too.
Yeah, yeah, and that's sort of the protectionism, right? That hurts that free market, right? So we protect individual property, so like intellectual property, like the CrossFit brand. There is not anyone could just go buy a bike either. Like there's a lot of free trade. Like where do those parts come from? What's allowed to be traded. There will be people on one hand they want completely free trade, and on the other hand they want government regulations to protect businesses from China or the U.S. and competition. So pure free trade in theory benefits everybody. The problem is it benefits everybody equally, and a lot of people don't want that. Right? They don't actually want that equality. They want more for themselves, so they want to protect what they already own. um, I guess the theory of this is just it's a more nuanced competition. I think from a small business standpoint, there's things we can learn about the free market if we want that free market. And one is, the labor market, which we've talked about before on the podcast, and people sort of, getting mad because there's a shortage of labor. But in the free market, when our supplies, and demand are tight, you have to raise your prices for that. Um, and people don't want that to happen, right? They kind of want some sort of government intervention to keep wages low so that their business can benefit. But hey, that free market you want all the time when you want lower regulations is now costing you because people are going to move where labor is, um, or where jobs are, where they can build the life that they want to build. So you need to also be competing for that labor.
Yeah. I like that the narrative of that labor shortage term has changed to the great resignation, right? And I heard someone last week on a podcast, I meant to tell you this. They're not calling it the Great Resignation, they're calling it the Great Epiphany.
Uh,
Employees and just common folk workers realizing, I don't want to be doing this. I don't want to be doing this under these conditions. I don't want to be doing this for this pay. It's not the Great Resignation, it's the Great Epiphany, which I think is fantastic.
and that's a really neat thing too, because when you look at, let's look at restaurants, for example, and you look at the free market, there are, there's always going to be people who want to buy food, whether that's ingredients and they're cooking it themselves or prepaid food.
People love
Like
food.
people love food and food will find a way. When you look at hospitality industry and how you as a business take advantage of selling that food, you need labor. So if we've created an industry where everybody hates the job except for, people maybe who are really good at it, part of the way the market works itself out is like we could have way less restaurants, but they could be better and more expensive to go to a restaurant. Or it just completely changes it to maybe a model we haven't thought of again. And that is kind of the free market at work. Whereas if the government came in and was like, no, you have to work in hospitality. Like if you worked there before the pandemic, we're forcing you now to go back and you get low wages. Like, that's planned and not the free market. But sometimes, these problems business owners have is the free market working itself out and getting the right labor and the right mix of services that people want to buy at the right price that allows you to have that business in a profit making manner.
Like the problem isn't free market, then the problem is competition.
Well, which is part of the free market, right? You have those
Yeah,
barriers to
fair.
entry. The problem is also substitutes. So again, if you're going to be pro free market, you have to know that there's competition, there's substitutes. Like if I go to a steakhouse and it costs me $200 for a great experience and a great steak, but I could buy that steak for $40 and then buy a cooking class to learn how to cook it perfectly for $50, then maybe I do that instead of go to the steakhouse. So people will seek out substitutes. They're going to seek out, the great epiphany. They're going to go, move more towards the things that they like. And that type of movement is going to happen more in a more free market.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So anyway, I think that's, again, as a small business owner and how this relates to small business is understanding that, when we typically have quite a bit of freedom, not a lot of small businesses are really heavily regulated.
No.
Some have there's health things, there's some taxation things that you have to be aware of. And I'm all for continuing to modernize and making those things make sense or, be as fair as possible. But we are dealing with humans and we are dealing with a mostly free market. And sometimes those changes happen in bigger waves, just because that, the great epiphany is a great example of that. Most people aren't going to have that epiphany until you make it so they can't work for a while and they have the time and ability to think that out. We also, with like labor and labor movement, sometimes people won't just move for higher paying jobs because they like where they live or their family's around.
Sure.
But you get other things like high real estate prices or people not able to buy or move, then it forces you to think of, where are you going to move? And if you have that freedom of movement to be able to go, work somewhere else, live somewhere else, sort of that will happen and it will be part of sort of the free market moving around.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the real estate market, which seems so heavily regulated, but in the same sense, it seems like it's hurting.
Oh, it's definitely barely regulated. And it's another example of like a club that's designed for certain types of transactions. We don't have rules, very good rules around things like money laundering. There's all sorts of sort of government, not free market things at play.
You've almost
Um,
made me come to the other side of the fence, or the other side of like actually being for a not a free market, but for regulation, because like you said, it's a way to protect and help people. And most of the regulation that you're like, if you really think about it, you can kick and scream and shout from the rooftop that we don't have freedoms and we don't have a free market to do all this stuff. But if you really look at a lot of those like regulations, licensing rules, it is there to help people. It is supposed to be trying to create a level playing field and make sure people don't end up taken advantage of or dead.
I used to believe that too, and I think it's mostly right, and I think it's what most people want. I think the cynic or the history lesson is looking at who those things benefit, but that's why we do need advocates, and we need people to be taking down those barriers as much as possible. And it's never going to be perfect. So, like, we're never in that free market. It's never going to be a vacuum, but we can try to have as few sort of interventions as possible that are preventing sort of a general free movement of sort of the invisible hand, or you want sort of general supply and demand to sort things out as much as possible. You don't want the government sort of in there holding something down long term that doesn't need to be regulated.
Right. You want government to focus on garbage and roads, as you
Yeah,
put it.
it could be garbage and roads. Yeah, things for the betterment of all, I guess, from a small business standpoint. Um, yeah, I guess we've talked about this sort of all over the place. If I were to sum it up for most small businesses, it's the reality check of really looking at what are the regulations you have to follow, um, really understanding those and following them as best as possible, or lobbying as you need to have those changed. But then also realizing that we do mostly have a free market. And if, people aren't buying something from you, if you can't find labor, like sometimes that's just your free market. You talk about like sorting things out, and you want to be on the right side of that.
How do people go about finding that information then? Like it's challenging to find online. It's overwhelming. It's really sometimes difficult to understand. Are they going to the bank? Are they going to a lawyer? Who would you suggest that a small business owner or entrepreneur goes to for that?
For like regulations, you mean?
Yeah, like how to start their business in
Yeah,
that regard.
part of that's the barriers to entry. I mean, you can talk to a profit coach about that. They might be able to point you in the right direction. There's industry groups, I think, are a good source for that. Some of that's your investment. So when we start a business, we're looking to exploit a resource. We're maybe looking to put in more supply to something where there's a high demand, or we're looking to create a demand because you know, the only way to make profit is to exploit something like that. So being the one who can go in and understand those regulations is what's going to be your sort of secret sauce to make money. So there might not be a perfect way to do that. So you have to go find that out. If there aren't rules, then you're looking at, just different ways and say marketing to get to the humans that you can solve their problems, or you can sell their stuff to, and you want to do it before any other substitutes catch up to you, or any competitors jump in, and that's a whole other conversation we can have. But I guess that's the other point you've sort of brought me to, is like it's an invisible hand, but there's no free lunches, and you don't just set it and forget it. So like every business, you have to be changing and adapting and reading the market and keeping up to it long term. Because when the market's perfectly free and supply and demand are perfectly equal, everything's stable, and it's really hard to make economic profit. So you can make a living, but you're not making a sort of above average profit until you shift and do something different, which is just kind of cool as well.
Yeah. Economic profit. That's the name of the game.
Yeah, that's really what we want. And that's really hard to do. And once you get it, everyone's going to come in and try to copy you. So you got to do something else to sort of stay ahead of them, which makes it interesting and why business is really hard. And running a small business is even harder because typically, you just have a smaller client base, a smaller base of resources to draw from. So you just got to keep on it.
Yeah. It's supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, everyone would do it. The hard is what makes it great.
All right. On that note, we would love to help you figure this stuff out for yourselves. If you want to work with us, check us out at kawarthasmallbusinesspodcast.ca. You can also email us directly at setitup@kawarthasmallbusinesspodcast.ca.